Welcome to another video on GMAT Verbal. This is Perfect Scores Premium TV and this video focuses on the strategies for critical reasoning. Remember, the first module is only on the introduction and basic strategies, and before this you should have done the video on basic introduction to the GMAT Verbal section and the strategies for sentence correction. In this video of critical reasoning, we'll be discussing specifically the critical reasoning question types and the basic strategies. After this, you need to watch another video on strategies for reading comprehension. And as I told you, you can always email us at perfectscores89@gmail.com, visit and like our Facebook page, and you can also visit our website perfect-scores.com. So let's get started with the basics of critical reasoning, that is arguments. Because what is given to you in a critical reasoning question is an argument followed by a question, or sometimes it's referred to as a question stem, and then you have the 5 options out of which you have to choose one. So what is an argument? Here are two different items given to you. One of these is an argument, one of these is just a random statement. So if you look at the first one, you need to fire John. Now this is not an argument. This is just a random statement. You're just saying something. Right? So let me put it that way. It's just a random statement. However, if you come to the second one, it says you need to fire John. He hasn't turned up for work since 5 days ago. Now this is an argument because this argument has something that you need to say. That is, you need to fire John. This is the conclusion of the argument. Be very careful with these terms. You need to know them very well because they'll be helpful in arguments as well as in the AWA section. So when you're given this, you need to fire John. That is your basic conclusion. But when you say he hasn't turned up for work since 5 days ago, now this statement is something that is supporting the conclusion. That means this is your premise. Premise or the evidence, a reason why you are coming to the conclusion. So conclusion is the basic point, the basic conclusion of the whole argument, the point that the author wants to put forward, and everything else that supports that is the premise of the argument. So let's come down to a few more examples of the critical reasoning argument. So here is another example. I had an ice cream yesterday and today my tooth is aching. Hence, to prevent toothaches, I will stay away from ice cream. Now you see these words like hence or other words like thus, therefore, so, hence, because of this. So all these words give you an inclination that this part is the conclusion, and the remaining part that is giving you details to support the conclusion, that is, had an ice cream yesterday, today my tooth is aching, these are known as the premises. Now, apart from conclusion and premise, there is another thing that is present that is known as an assumption. But remember, assumptions are never mentioned in the argument. They are always hidden, and they are the important link between the premise and the conclusion. You're saying that you had an ice cream yesterday, today the tooth is aching. So in other words, the ice cream caused the toothache. So that is your conclusion. The basic assumption would be that the ice cream is the only cause for the toothache. Or in the future also, if you will have an ice cream, you will have toothaches. So you have 3 parts of an argument. You have the premises that support the conclusion and that are based on the basic underlying assumption. So these are the 3 parts, and in critical reasoning you will find that 80% of your CR questions can be based and can be solved if you know these three terms very well. If you can understand and find out what is the assumption, what is the conclusion, what is the premise, you can easily solve around 80% of the CR questions. So let's do this argument now. It says the rate of crime has increased over the last few years. So we know that crime has increased. The police have now decided to install surveillance cameras at major intersections. Now crime has increased and cameras will be installed. Now in these kind of arguments you see there is no word like hence, thus, therefore, so, or eventually. So what happens in these kind of arguments is that the entire argument acts like a conclusion. So we know that the crime has increased and cameras will be installed. So the conclusion is that these cameras will help to bring down the crime rate. So that would be the conclusion, and if you see, it's not mentioned anywhere that the surveillance cameras will help to bring down the rate of crime which had increased over the last few years. Another one, cheese spread contains 50% less calories per tablespoon than does a tablespoon of butter. So, cheese spread contains 50% less calories as compared to a tablespoon of butter. Thus, a sandwich with cheese spread filling is healthier than one with butter filling. Therefore, it says the sandwich with the cheese spread filling will be healthier. Now, it's very easy to find out the conclusion. It is this sentence that starts with thus. The remaining part is the premise. But in this case, what are the assumptions? Now, if you see, the argument is talking about calories, 50% less calories, and somehow the conclusion is talking about health. So that will be the first assumption over here, that less calories mean health. Because if this assumption is not there, if it's not present, then you cannot use the information on calories and conclude something about health. This is a basic underlying assumption that less calories will lead to health. Another assumption is that a sandwich that will be having cheese spread and that will be having butter will be having equal quantities of both. So equal quantity of the cheese spread and the butter will be applied. That is another basic assumption, because again, if this assumption is proven wrong, then this entire argument will also weaken. If suppose you say that butter was there only for 1 teaspoon, whereas 20 tablespoons of cheese spread were put on that sandwich. Now in that case, the sandwich with cheese spread will not be healthier anymore. Right? So these two are the basic assumptions. And remember, assumptions are fixed. They are not just random guesses. Right? So never make this mistake of using a guess about the argument as an assumption. Assumptions are fixed and they are not any kind of guess. So here are a few patterns that you will be seeing in GMAT quite often. The first is cause and effect. Let me take that same example. You eat an ice cream and then you get a toothache. So that is the premise. Event A is happening and then event B is happening. The conclusion is that A has caused B. That means the ice cream has caused the toothache. So there are three assumptions in this kind of pattern, in this kind of argument. That is, it's not a coincidence, or in other words, every time you eat an ice cream, you will suffer from a toothache. The second assumption is that there is no other cause. That means only ice cream is responsible for the toothache, nothing else. And the third one is that the reverse is not true. If these two things are happening at the same time, it is not possible that first you had a toothache and then you ate an ice cream, right? So that is the third assumption. Now these assumptions are fixed, and if you get a question that uses this pattern of cause and effect, you can very well write down these three assumptions in front of you according to the words used in that argument, and then you can choose based on this. I mean to say, choose the options based on these three assumptions. The next one, the next pattern is that of planning, just like the cameras example, that crime has increased, so cameras will be installed. So the premise is that there is a plan, that cameras will help to reduce the crime, and conclusion is that the plan will work, or in other words, there are no problems in the plan, or if there are, they can be easily solved. So the basic assumption is that there are no problems in the plan. Now, let me put a question. If you have a question that asks you to strengthen the argument, what you need to do is find an option that exactly means the same thing, that there are no problems. However, if you want to weaken the argument, you need to point out a problem. This means what? That questions that are based on strengthening the argument are basically looking for an assumption in the options. You need to find an option that looks exactly the same as an assumption. And in questions that ask you to weaken the argument, you need to look for an option that goes against the assumption. Okay, I hope this is clear that for strengthening the argument, you need to say or you need to restate whatever the assumption is saying. But in order to weaken the argument, you need to go exactly opposite to what the assumptions are saying. For example, let me go back to the question on the ice cream and toothache. The conclusion was that the ice cream caused the toothache. And the assumption was that only ice cream is causing the toothache. So if you find an option that says that there is something else that caused the toothache, maybe a previous decay or maybe some other problem, then we'll be able to weaken this argument. So that is what I'm explaining over here, that if you want to weaken the argument, you need to go against the assumptions. The next pattern that you have is sampling. The premise is that data is given for a subset of a population. For example, there's a college and I conduct a survey on 5 students of that college and they tell me something about that college. The conclusion is same data applies to the entire population. Let's say these 5 students say that exams should be scrapped, right? Exams should end and they should no longer be held. And the conclusion is that all the college students are saying that the exams should finish. There should not be any kind of exams in the future. So the basic assumption is that these 5 students represent the entire college. So that is the assumption, that the sample is truly representative of the entire data. So remember, premise will talk about a subset of the population, conclusion will talk about the entire population. Assumption is that the subset or the sample truly represents the entire population. The next one is interpretation of evidence. Usually in these kind of arguments, you find a lot of numbers, percentages, and ratios are given to you. So you have to play your way around them and try to find out what is the conclusion and what is the premise. So premise is facts or a piece of evidence. For example, if I say in 2008, 20% of the class failed, while in 2010, only 10% of the class failed. So the conclusion will be a particular interpretation of that evidence. For example, these are the failing rates given. So I may very well conclude that the passing numbers or the number of students that are passing has increased. So the basic assumption is that there is no other way to interpret the facts, that the numbers are correct and this is the only interpretation available. But if you look at weakening this argument, you can very well say that the total number of students who appeared for the test, that total number came down. That is why the failing percentage has decreased, or the total number remained the same or it increased. So based on the total number of students who actually took the test, your argument can very well be strengthened, weakened, or it could remain the same. right? So that is the basic assumption that there's no other way to interpret the facts. So this is the basic strategy, what you need to do for a critical reasoning question. First, you need to read the question. So what I told you is that you will be given an argument which will have its own conclusion, premise, and assumptions. And then you will be given a question stem or a question, and then you will be given your 5 options. So before going to the argument, you need to read the question first, then you need to work the argument, then you need to predict your answer, and then the process of elimination. Eliminate the answers that are wrong and come down to the actual answer. So here is how your scratch paper should look like. You have the question number. What this is a basic prediction of the argument. You have your options. As soon as you know a few options are wrong, you eliminate them, you come down to your answer choice. Here are the types of questions that you will get for critical reasoning in the GMAT verbal section. First is based on assumption. These are quite direct. You just have to find the assumption of the argument. Strengthen. You need to find an option that strengthens the argument. You may have to find an option that weakens the argument. Remember, all 3 of them can be solved by using the information on conclusion, premise, and assumption. And the best thing is, these 3 question types, they form 80% of your critical reasoning questions. You will find these are the maximum questions that occur most often, specifically the weakening questions and the assumption questions. These are very, very common. You may find up to 4 of the weakening questions and up to 3 of these assumption based questions in your actual test. And apart from these, you have these question types. Evaluate an argument. So that is basically on how to find out whether the argument is a strong one or a weak one. Then you have to find flaw in the reasoning of the argument. Basically, that's a weakening question. Bold-faced questions. That means 2 parts of an argument will be written in bold, and you have to tell what part do they play, or why are they bold, and what are the functions of those 2 parts that are given in bold with respect to one another. The next question type that you may face is how to complete an incomplete argument, and then you may have questions on explaining an argument or resolving a problem that is given in the argument. So these are the basic types of questions that you will get in critical reasoning. Now coming to wrong answers, this is where I give you the process of elimination tips. This is what we talked about in the first video in introduction. When you do not have enough time, when you are stuck in the end of the test and critical reasoning question instead, you need to use these tips to eliminate some answers. The first kind of wrong answer is that is out of scope or irrelevant. For example, the question is talking about New York, but the option is talking about, let's say, Boston. Now that would be a totally irrelevant option. You can easily eliminate that. An option that is extreme, that is using words like never, always, must, stand still. So these are very extreme words. Usually these options are wrong. Then you have something that tells the opposite. You're looking for an option that strengthens the argument, but there is an option that is actually weakening the argument in some way. That would be a wrong answer. And that's all in the critical reasoning wrong answer types. So after this, the next video that you need to watch is on strategies for reading comprehension. So that's all for the basic strategies. There will be a lot of more videos on critical reasoning that we'll be discussing the question types in detail one by one, and we'll also be solving a lot of questions in those videos. Thank you so much for watching this video.